After Virtue, A Study in Moral Theory by Alasdair MacIntyre. 3rd edition. University of Notre Dame Press, Notre Dame, Indiana. Table of Contents. Prologue. After Virtue, after a quarter of a century. Preface. Chapter 1, A Disquieting Suggestion. Chapter 2, The Nature of Moral Disagreement Today and the Claims of Emotivism. Chapter 3, Emotivism, Social Content and Social Context. Chapter 4, The Predecessor Culture and the Enlightenment Project of Justifying Morality. Chapter 5, Why the Enlightenment Project of Justifying Morality had to fail. Chapter 6, Some Consequences of the Failure of the Enlightenment Project. Chapter 7, So-called Fact, Explanation, and Expertise. Chapter 8, The Character of Generalizations in Social Science and Their Lack of Predictive Power. Chapter 9, Nietzsche or Aristotle. Chapter 10, The Virtues of Heroic Societies. Chapter 11, The Virtues of Athens. Chapter 12, Aristotle's Account of the Virtues. Chapter 13, Medieval Aspects and Occasions. Chapter 14, The Nature of the Virtues. Chapter 15, The Virtues, the Unity of a Human Life, and the Concept of a Tradition. Chapter 16, From the Virtues to Virtue and After Virtue. Chapter 17, Justice as a Virtue, Changing Conceptions. Chapter 18, After Virtue, Nietzsche or Aristotle, Trotsky, and Saint Benedict. Chapter 19, Postscript to the 2nd edition. Bibliography, Index. Prologue. After Virtue, after a quarter of a century. If there are good reasons to reject the central theses of After Virtue, by now I should certainly have learned what they are. Critical and constructive discussion in a wide range of languages, not only English, Danish, Polish, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Italian, and Turkish, but also Chinese and Japanese, and from a wide range of standpoints, has enabled me to reconsider and to extend the inquiries that I began in After Virtue in 1981, and continued in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, 1988, Three Rival Visions of Moral Inquiry, 1990, and Dependent Rational Animals, 1999. But I have as yet found no reason for abandoning the major contentions of After Virtue. Unteachable obstinacy, some will say, although I have learned a great deal and supplemented and revised my theses and arguments accordingly. Central to these was and is the claim that it is only possible to understand the dominant moral culture of advanced modernity adequately from a standpoint external to that culture. That culture has continued to be one of unresolved and apparently unresolvable moral and other disagreements, in which the invaluative and normative utterances of the contending parties presented a problem of interpretation. For, on the one hand, they seemed to presuppose a reference to some shared impersonal standard in virtue of which at most one of those contending parties can be in the right, and yet, on the other, the poverty of the arguments adduced in support of their assertions, and the characteristically shrill and assertive and expressive mode in which they are uttered, suggest strongly that there is no such standard. My explanation was, and is, that the precepts that are thus uttered were once at home in, and intelligible in terms of, a context of practical beliefs and supporting habits of thought, feeling, and action, a context that has since been lost, a context in which moral judgments were understood as governed by impersonal standards justified by a shared conception of the human good. Deprived of that context and of that justification, as a result of disruptive and transformative social and moral changes in the late Middle Ages and the early modern world, moral rules and precepts had to be understood in a new way and assigned some new status, authority, and justification. It became the task of the moral philosophers of the European Enlightenment from the 18th century onwards to provide just such an understanding. But what those philosophers in fact provided were several rival and incompatible accounts. Utilitarians competing with Kantians, and both with contractarians, so that moral judgments, as they had come now to be understood, became essentially contestable, expressive of the attitudes and feelings of those who uttered them, and still uttered as if there was some impersonal standard by which moral disagreements might be rationally resolved. And from the outset, such disagreements concerned not only the justification, but also the content of morality. This salient characteristic of the moral culture of modernity has not changed, and I remain equally committed to the thesis that it is only from the standpoint of a very different tradition, one whose beliefs and presuppositions were articulated in their classical form by Aristotle, that we can understand both the genesis and the predicament of moral modernity. It is important to note that I am not claiming that Aristotelian moral theory is able to exhibit its rational superiority in terms that would be acceptable to the protagonists of the dominant post-Enlightenment moral philosophies, so that in theoretical contests in the arenas of modernity, Aristotelians might be able to defeat Kantians, utilitarians, and contractarians. Not only is this evidently not so, but in those same arenas, Aristotelianism is bound to appear, and does appear, as just one more type of moral theory, one whose protagonists have as much and as little hope of defeating their rivals as do utilitarians, Kantians, or contractarians. What, then, was I and am I claiming? That from the standpoint of an ongoing way of life informed by and expressed through Aristotelian concepts, it is possible to understand what the predicament of moral modernity is, and why the culture of moral modernity lacks the resources to proceed further with its own moral inquiries, so that sterility and frustration are bound to afflict those unable to extricate themselves from those predicaments. What I now understand much better than I did 25 years ago is the nature of the relevant Aristotelian commitments, and this in at least two ways. When I wrote After Virtue, I was already an Aristotelian, but not yet a Thomist, something made plain in my account of Aquinas at the end of chapter 13. I became a Thomist after writing After Virtue, in part because I became convinced that Aquinas was in some respects a better Aristotelian than Aristotle, that not only was he an excellent interpreter of Aristotle's texts, but that he had been able to extend and deepen both Aristotle's metaphysical and moral inquiries. And this altered my standpoint in at least three ways. In After Virtue, I had tried to present the case for a broadly Aristotelian account of the virtues without making use of our appeal to what I called Aristotle's metaphysical biology. And I was of course right in rejecting most of that biology. But I had now learned from Aquinas that my attempt to provide an account of the human good purely in social terms, in terms of practices, traditions, and the narrative unity of human lives, was bound to be inadequate until I had provided it with a metaphysical grounding. It is only because human beings have an end towards which they are directed by reason of their specific nature that the practices, traditions, and the like are able to function as they do. So I discovered that I had, without realizing it, presupposed the truth of something very close to the account of the content of good that Aquinas gives in question 5 in the first part of the Summa Theologica. What I also came to recognize was that my conception of human beings as virtuous or vicious needed not only a metaphysical but also a biological grounding, although not an especially Aristotelian one. This I provided a good deal later in Dependent Rational Animals, where I argued that the moral significance of the animality of human beings, or of rational animals, can only be understood if our kinship to some species of not yet rational animals, including dolphins, is recognized. And in the same book, I was also able to give a better account of the content of the virtues by identifying what I called the virtues of acknowledged dependence. In so doing, I drew on Aquinas' discussion of miscordia, a discussion in which Aquinas is more at odds with Aristotle than he himself realized. These developments, in my thought, were the outcome of reflection on Aquinas' texts and on commentary on those texts by contemporary Thomistic writers. A very different set of developments was due to the stimulus of criticisms of after virtue by those who were in radical disagreement with it. Let me approach their criticisms by beginning from one that seems to result not from a misunderstanding, but from a careless misreading of the text. Because I understand the tradition of the virtues to have arisen within and to have been first adequately articulated in the Greek, especially the Athenian polis, and because I have stressed the ways in which that tradition flourished in the European Middle Ages, I have been accused of nostalgia and of idealizing the past. But there is, I think, not a trace of this in the text. What there is an insistence on our need to learn from some aspects of the past by understanding our contemporary selves and our contemporary moral relationships in the light afforded by a tradition that enables us to overcome the constraints on such self-knowledge that modernity, especially advanced modernity, imposes. We are all of us inescapably inhabitants of advanced modernity, bearing its social and cultural marks. So my understanding of the tradition of the virtues and of the consequences for modernity is of its rejection of that tradition, and of the possibility of restoring it is indeed a particularly modern understanding. It is only retrospectively, from the standpoint of modernity, and in response to its predicaments, that we can identify the continuities and discontinuities of the tradition of the virtues, as it has been embodied in a variety of cultural forms. The kind of historical inquiry that I undertook in After Virtue only became possible in the 18th and 19th centuries. Vico was the prophetic originator of that kind of historical inquiry, and my own greatest debt in this area was to R.G. Collingwood, although my understanding of the nature and complexity of traditions I owe most of all to J.H. Newman. What historical inquiry discloses is the situatedness of all inquiry, the extent to which what are taken to be the standards of truth and of rational justification in the contexts of practice vary from one time and place to another. If one adds to that disclosure, as I have done, a denial that there are available to any rational agent whatsoever standards of truth and of rational justification such that appeal to them could be sufficient to resolve fundamental moral, scientific, or metaphysical disputes in a conclusive way, then it may seem that an accusation of relativism has been invited. The word accusation is perhaps out of place, since I have been congratulated on my alleged relativism by those who have tried to claim me as a postmodernist. See Peter Watson, The Modern Mind, An Intellectual History of the 20th Century. New York HarperCollins, 2001, pages 678 to 79. In the postscript to the second edition of After Virtue, I already sketched an answer to this charge, and I developed that answer further in Whose Justice, Which Rationality? Yet the charge is still repeated, so let me once again identify what it is that enables, indeed requires me to reject relativism. The Aristotelian and Thomistic tradition of the virtues is, like some, although not all other moral traditions, a tradition of inquiry. It is characteristic of traditions of inquiry that they claim truth for their central theses and soundness for their central arguments. Were it otherwise, they would find it difficult either to characterize the aim and object of their inquiries or to give reasons for their conclusions. But since they are and have been at odds with one another in their standards of rational justification, indeed, the question of what those standards should be is among the matters that principally divide them. And since each has its own standards internal to itself, disputes between them seem to be systematically unsettleable, even although the contending parties may share both respect for the requirements of logic and a core but minimal conception of truth. Examples of such rival traditions that are palpably at odds in this way are the Aristotelian and Thomistic tradition, the kind of Buddhism whose greatest philosophical name is Nagarjuna, and the modern European and North American utilitarianism. How then, if at all, might the protagonists of one of these traditions hope to defeat the claims of any of its rivals? A necessary first step would be for them to come to understand what it is to think in terms of in the terms prescribed by that particular rival tradition, to learn how to think as if one were a convinced adherent of that rival tradition. To do this requires the exercise of a capacity for philosophical imagination that is often lacking. A second step is to identify, from the standpoint of the adherents of that rival tradition, its crucially important unresolved issues and unsolved problems, unresolved and unsolved by the standards of that tradition, which now confront these adherents, and to inquire how progress might be made in moving towards their resolution and solution. It is when, in spite of systematic inquiry, issues and problems that are of crucial importance to some tradition remain unresolved and unsolved that a question arises about it, namely, just why it is that progress in this area is no longer being made. Is it perhaps because that tradition lacks the resources to address those issues and solve those problems and is unable to acquire them so long as it remains faithful to its own standard and presuppositions? Is it perhaps the constraints imposed by those standards and deriving from those presuppositions themselves? Is it perhaps that constraints imposed by those standards and deriving from those presuppositions themselves prevent the formulation or reformulation of those issues and problems so that they can be adequately addressed and solved? And if the answer to those two questions is yes, is it perhaps the case that it is only from the standpoint of some rival tradition that this predicament can be understood, and from the resources of that same rival tradition that the means of overcoming this predicament can be found? When the adherents of a tradition are able, through such acts of imagination and questioning, to interrogate some particular rival tradition, it is always possible that they may be able to conclude, indeed, that they may be compelled to conclude, that it is only from the standpoint of their own tradition that the difficulties of the rival tradition can be adequately understood and overcome. It is only if the central theses of their own tradition are true and its arguments sound that this rival tradition can be expected to encounter just those difficulties that it has encountered, and that its lack of conceptual, normative, and other resources to deal with these difficulties can be explained. So it is possible for one such tradition to defeat another in respect of the adequacy of its claims to truth and to rational justification, even though there are no neutral standards available by appeal to which any rational agent whatsoever could determine which tradition is superior to which. Yet, just because there are no such neutral standards, the protagonists of a defeated tradition may not recognize, and may not be able to recognize, that such a defeat has occurred. They may well recognize that they confront problems of their own to which no fully satisfactory solution has yet been advanced, but it may be that nothing compels them to go any further than this, they will still take themselves to have excellent reasons for rejecting any invitation to adopt the standpoint of any other rival and incompatible tradition, even in imagination, for if the basic principles that they now assert are true and rationally justified, as they take them to be, then those assertions advanced by adherents of rival traditions that are incompatible with their own must be false and must lack rational justification. So they will continue, perhaps indefinitely, to defend their own positions and to proceed with their own inquiries, unable to recognize that those inquiries are in fact condemned to sterility and frustration. It is, of course, important that for very, very long periods of time rival traditions of moral inquiry may coexist. As Thomistic Aristotelianism, Mahayana Buddhism, and modern European and North American utilitarianism have coexisted, without any one of them having had occasion to take the claims of its rivals seriously, let alone having conducted the kind of inquiry that might issue in one of these traditions suffering rational defeat at the hands of another. And it is also true that such an inquiry may not in fact lead to any definitive outcome, so that the issues dividing those rival traditions may remain undecided. Yet what matters most is that such issues can on occasion be decided, and this in a way that makes it evident that the claims of such rival traditions from the outset presuppose the falsity of relativism. As do I, and as must any serious inquirer. Let me turn now to a very different criticism, that of those defenders of liberal and individualist modernity who frame their objections in terms of the liberalism versus communitarian debate, supposing me to be a communitarian, something that I have never been. I see no value in community as such. Many types of community are nastily oppressive, and the values of community, as understood by the American spokespersons of contemporary communitarianism, such as Amantai Enzoni, are compatible with and supportive of the values of the liberalism that I reject. My own critique of liberalism derives from a judgment that the best type of human life, that in which the tradition of the virtues is most adequately embodied, is lived by those engaged in constructing and sustaining forms of community directed towards the shared achievement of those common goods without which the ultimate human good cannot be achieved. Liberal political societies are characteristically committed to denying any place for a determinate conception of the human good in their public discourse, let alone allowing that their common life should be grounded in such a conception. On the dominant liberal view, government is to be neutral as between rival conceptions of the human good, yet in fact what liberalism promotes is a kind of institutional order that is inimical to the construction and sustaining of the types of communal relationship required for the best kind of human life. This critique of liberalism should not be interpreted as a sign of any sympathy on my part for contemporary conservatism. That conservatism is, in too many ways, a mirror image of the liberalism that it professedly opposes. Its commitment to a way of life structured by a free market economy is a commitment to an individualism as corrosive as that of liberalism. And yet, where liberalism, by permissive legal enactments, has tried to use the power of the modern state to transform social relationships, conservatism, by prohibitive legal enactments, now tries to use that same power for its own coercive purposes. Such conservatism is alien to the projects of after virtue as liberalism is, and the figure cut by present-day conservative moralists with their inflated and self-righteous unironic rhetoric should be set alongside those figures whom I identified in Chapter 3 of After Virtue as notable characters in the cultural dramas of modernity, that of the therapist who has in the last 20 years become bemused by biochemical discoveries, that that of the corporate manager, who is now mouthing formulas that he or she learned in a course in business ethics, while still trying to justify her or his pretensions to expertise, and that of the aesthete, who is presently emerging from a devotion to conceptual art. So the conservative moralist has become one more stock character in the scripted conversations of the ruling elites of advanced modernity. But those elites never have the last word. When recurrently the tradition of the virtues is regenerated, it is always in everyday life. It is always through the engagement by plain persons in a variety of practices, including those of making and sustaining families and households, schools, clinics, and local forms of political community, and that regeneration enables such plain persons to put to the question the dominant modes of moral and social discourse and the institutions that find their expression in those modes. It was they who were the intended and pleasingly often actual readers of After Virtue, able to recognize in its central theses articulations of thoughts that they themselves had already begun to formulate and expressions of feeling by which they themselves were already to some degree moved. In my opening chapter, I alluded to A Canticle for Leibowitz, that extraordinary novel by Walter M. Miller, Jr., and in the closing sentences of my final chapter, I alluded to that fine poem by Constantine Koffes, Waiting for the Barbarians, over-optimistically expecting both those allusions to be widely recognized. Since they have all too often not been recognized, let me now acknowledge explicitly these and other debts of the imagination, debts as important in their own way as the intellectual debts acknowledged in the text. I should also make it clear that, although After Virtue was written in part out of recognition of those moral inadequacies of Marxism which its 20th century history has disclosed, I was and remain deeply indebted to Marx's critique of the economic, social, and cultural order of capitalism, and to the development of that critique by later Marxists. In the last sentence of After Virtue, I spoke of us as waiting for another Saint Benedict. Benedict's greatness lay in making possible a quite new kind of institution, that of the monastery of prayer, learning, and labor, in which and around which communities could not only survive, but flourish in a period of social and cultural darkness. The effects of Benedict's founding insights and of their institutional embodiment by those who learned from them were from the standpoint of his own age quite unpredictable. And it was my intention to suggest, when I wrote that last sentence in 1980, that ours too is a time of waiting for new and unpredictable possibilities of renewal. It is also a time for resisting as prudently and courageously and justly and temperately as possible the dominant social, economic, and political order of advanced modernity. So it was 26 years ago. So it is still. Preface. This book emerged from extended reflection upon the inadequacies of my own earlier work in moral philosophy, and from a growing dissatisfaction with the contemporary conception of so-called moral philosophy as an independent and isolable area of inquiry. A central theme of much of that earlier work, A Short History of Ethics, 1966, Secularization and Moral Change, 1967, Against the Self-Images of the Age, 1971, was that we have to learn from history and anthropology of the variety of moral practices, beliefs, and conceptual schemes. The notion that the moral philosopher can study the concepts of morality merely by reflecting, Oxford armchair style, on what he or she and those around him or her say and do is barren. This conviction I have found no good reason to abandon, and immigration to the United States has taught me that when the armchair is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in Princeton, New Jersey, it functions no better. But at the same time, as I was affirming the variety and heterogeneity of moral beliefs, practices, and concepts, it became clear that I was committing myself to evaluations of different particular beliefs, practices, and concepts. I gave, or tried to give, for example, accounts of the rise and decline of different moralities, and it was as clear to others as it ought to have been to me that my historical and sociological accounts were, and could not but be, informed by a distinctive evaluative standpoint. More particularly, I seem to be asserting that the nature of moral community and moral judgment in distinctively modern societies was such that it was no longer possible to appeal to moral criteria in a way that had been possible in other times and places, and that this was a moral calamity. But to what could I be appealing if my own analysis was correct? At the same time, ever since the days when I was privileged to be a contributor to that most remarkable journal, The New Reasoner, I had been preoccupied with the question of the basis for the moral rejection of Stalinism. Many of those who rejected Stalinism did so by re-invoking the principles of liberalism in the criticism of which Marxism originated. Since I continued, and continue, to accept much of the substance of that criticism, this answer was not available to me. One cannot, I wrote in responding to the positions when taken by Lentz Kalwowski, receive the moral content within Marxism by simply taking a Stalinist view of historical development and adding liberal morality to it. Moreover, I came to understand that Marxism itself has suffered from grave and harm-engendering moral impoverishment, as much because of what it has inherited from liberal individualism as because of its departures from liberalism. The conclusion which I reached, and which is embodied in this book, although Marxism itself is only a marginal preoccupation, is that Marxism's moral defects and failures arise from the extent to which it, like liberal individualism, embodies the ethos of the distinctively modern and modernizing world, and that nothing less than a rejection of a large part of that ethos will provide us with a rationally and morally defensible standpoint from which to judge and act, and in terms of which to evaluate various rival and heterogeneous moral schemes which compete for our allegiance. This drastic conclusion, I need scarcely add, is not to be attributed to those whose genius and just criticism of my earlier work enabled me to understand much, although perhaps as yet not all, of what is wrong with it. Eric John, J.M. Cameron, and Alan Ryan, nor should blame attach for that conclusion to those friends and colleagues whose influence has been continuous for a number of years and to whom I am exceptionally indebted, Heinz Lubas and Max Vorovsky. Two of my colleagues at Boston University read large portions of my manuscript and made many helpful and illuminating suggestions. I owe a great debt of gratitude to Thomas McCarthy and Elizabeth Rappaport. Colleagues elsewhere to whom I am in debt in a variety of ways for similar suggestions are Marjorie Green and Richard Rorty. For typing and retyping this book, I am deeply grateful to Julie Keith Conley, and for several kinds of help in the production of the manuscript I have to thank Rosalie Carlson and Zara Chapin. I am also greatly indebted to the staff of the Boston Athenaeum and the London Library. Parts of this book have been read to various groups, and their extended critical responses have been most valuable to me. In particular, I must name the group that studied the foundations of ethics together for 3 years at the Hastings Center with the aid of a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Short passages from papers presented to that group in volumes 3 and 4 of the series on the foundations of ethics and its relationship to the sciences, 1978 and 1980, appear in chapters 9 and 14 of this book, and I am grateful to the Hastings Institute of Society, Ethics, and the Life Sciences for permission to reprint them. I must also name with deep gratitude two other groups, that is, the faculty members and graduate students of the Department of Philosophy of the University of Notre Dame, whose invitations to participate in their Perspectives lecture series allowed me some of the most important opportunities to develop the ideas in this book, and the members of my NEH seminar at Boston University in the summer of 1978, whose collegial criticism of my work on the virtues played a very important part in my education. I must also therefore thank once more the National Endowment for the Humanities itself. The dedication of this book expresses an indebtedness of a more fundamental order. If I had only recognized its fundamental character earlier, my progress towards the conclusions of this book could have been a good deal less tortuous, but I would not perhaps ever have been able to recognize it in a way that could help me towards those conclusions had it not been for what I owe to my wife, Lynn Sumitia Joy, in this as in so much else sine qua non. Watertown, Massachusetts, Alasdair MacIntyre. Chapter 1. A Disquieting Suggestion. Imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe. A series of environmental disasters are blamed by the general public on the scientists. Widespread riots occur. Laboratories are burnt down. Physicists are lynched. Books and instruments are destroyed. Finally, a know-nothing political movement takes power and successfully abolishes science teaching in schools and universities, imprisoning and executing the remaining scientists. Later still, there is a reaction against this destructive movement, and enlightened people seek to revive science, although they have largely forgotten what it was. But all that they possess are fragments, that is, a knowledge of experiments detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance, parts of theories unrelated either to the other bits and pieces of the theory which they possess or to experiment, instruments whose use has been forgotten, half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because torn and charred. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. Adults argue with each other about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, although they possess only a very partial knowledge of each. Children learn by heart the surviving portions of the periodic table and recite as incantations some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all. For everything that they do and say conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence, and those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they are doing have been lost, perhaps irretrievably. In such a culture, men would use expressions such as neutrino, mass, specific gravity, atomic weight, in systematic and often interrelated ways, which would resemble, in lesser or greater degrees, the ways in which such expressions have been used in earlier times before scientific knowledge had been largely lost. But many of the beliefs presupposed by the use of these expressions would have been lost, and there would appear to be an element of arbitrariness and even of choice in their application, which would appear very surprising to us. What would appear to be rival and competing premises for which no further argument could be given would abound. Subjectivistic theories of science would appear and would be criticized by those who held that the notion of truth embodied in what they took to be science was incompatible with subjectivism. This imaginary possible world is very like one that some science fiction writers have constructed. We may describe it as a world in which the language of natural science, or parts of it at least, continues to be used, but is in a grave state of disorder. We may notice that if in this imaginary world analytical philosophy were to flourish, it would never reveal the fact of this disorder. For the techniques of analytical philosophy are essentially descriptive and descriptive of the language of the present at that. The analytical philosopher would be able to elucidate the conceptual structures of what was taken to be scientific thinking and discourse in the imaginary world in precisely the way that he elucidates the conceptual structures of natural science as it is. Nor again would phenomenology or existentialism be able to discern anything wrong. All the structures of intentionality would be what they are now. The task of supplying an epistemological basis for these false simulacra of natural science would not differ in phenomenological terms from the tasks as it is presently envisaged. A Husserl or Merleau-Ponty would be as deceived as a Strawson or a Quine. What is the point of constructing this imaginary world inhabited by fictitious pseudoscientists and real genuine philosophy? The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I described. What we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts of which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess indeed simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have, very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. But how could this be so? The impulse to reject the whole suggestion out of hand will certainly be very strong. Our capacity to use moral language, to be guided by moral reasoning, to define our transactions with others in moral terms is so central to our view of ourselves that even to envisage the possibility of our radical incapacity in these respects is to ask for a shift in our view of what we are and do, which is going to be difficult to achieve. But we do already know two things about the hypothesis which are initially important for us if we are to achieve such a shift in viewpoint. One is that philosophical analysis will not help us. In the real world, the dominant philosophies of the present, analytical or phenomenological, will be as powerless to detect the disorders of moral thought and practice as they were impotent before the disorders of science in the imaginary world. Yet the powerlessness of this kind of philosophy does not leave us quite resourceless. For a prerequisite for understanding the present disordered state of the imaginary world was to understand its history, a history that had to be written in three distinct stages. The first stage was that in which the natural sciences flourished, the second, that in which they suffered catastrophe, and the third, that in which they were restored, but in damaged and disordered form. Notice that this history, being one of decline and fall, is informed by standards. It is not an evaluatively neutral chronicle. The form of the narrative, the division into stages, presuppose standards of achievement and failure, of order and disorder. It is what Hegel called philosophical history, and what Collingwood took all successful historical writing to be. So that, if we are to look for resources to investigate the hypothesis about morality which I have suggested, however bizarre and improbable it may appear to you now, we shall have to ask whether we can find the type of philosophy and history propounded by writers such as Hegel and Collingwood, very different from each other as they are, of course, resources which we cannot find in analytical or phenomenological philosophy. But this suggestion immediately brings to mind a crucial difficulty for my hypothesis. For one objection to the view of the imaginary world which I constructed, let alone to my view of the real world, is that the inhabitants of the imaginary world reached a point where they no longer realized the nature of the catastrophe which they had suffered. Yet surely an event of such striking world historical dimensions could not have been lost from view, so that it was both erased from memory and unrecoverable from historical records. And surely what holds of the fictitious world holds even more strongly of our own real world. If a catastrophe sufficient to throw the language and practice of morality into grave disorder had occurred, surely we would all know about it. It would indeed be one of the central facts of our history. Yet our history lies open to view, so it will be said, and no record of any such catastrophe survives, so my hypothesis must simply be abandoned. To this, I must at the very least concede that it will have to be expanded, yet, unfortunately, at the outset expanded in such a way as to render it, if possible, initially even less credible than before. For the catastrophe will have to have been of such a kind that it was not, and has not been, except perhaps by a very few, recognized as a catastrophe. We shall have to look not for a few brief striking events, whose character is incontestably clear, but for a much longer, more complex, and less easily identified process, and probably one which by its very nature is open to rival interpretation. Yet the initial implausibility of this part of the hypothesis may perhaps be slightly lessened by another suggestion. History by now, in our culture, means academic history, and academic history is less than 2 centuries old. Suppose it were the case that the catastrophe of which my hypothesis speaks had occurred before, or largely before, the founding of academic history, so that the moral and other evaluative presuppositions of academic history derived from the forms of the disorder which it brought about. Suppose, that is, that the standpoint of academic history is such that from its value-neutral viewpoint, moral disorder must remain largely invisible. All that the historian, and what is true of the historian is characteristically true also of the social scientist, will be allowed to perceive by the canons and categories of his discipline, will be one morality succeeding another, 17th century Puritanism, 18th century hedonism, the Victorian work ethic, and so on. But the very language of order and disorder will not be available to him. If this were to be so, it would at least explain why what I take to be the real world and its fate has remained unrecognized by the academic curriculum. For the forms of the academic curriculum would turn out to be among the symptoms of the disaster whose occurrence the curriculum does not acknowledge. Most academic history and sociology, the history of a Namer or of a Hofstadter, and the sociology of a Merton or a Lipset, are after all as far away from the historical standpoint of Hegel and Collingwood as most academic philosophy is from their philosophical perspective. It may seem to many readers that as I have elaborated my initial hypothesis, I have step by step deprived myself of very nearly all possible argumentative allies. But is not just this required by the hypothesis itself? For, if the hypothesis is true, it will necessarily appear implausible, since one way of starting part of the hypothesis is precisely to assert that we are in a condition which almost nobody recognizes, and which perhaps nobody at all can recognize fully. If my hypothesis appeared initially plausible, it would certainly be false. And, at least, if even to entertain this hypothesis puts me into an antagonistic stance, it is a very different antagonistic stance from that of, for example, modern radicalism. For the modern radical is as confident in the moral expression of his stances, and consequently in the assertive uses of the rhetoric of morality, as any conservative has ever been. Whatever else he denounces in our culture, he is certain that it still possesses the moral resources which he requires in order to denounce it. Everything else may be, in his eyes, in disorder, but the language of morality is in order just as it is. That he too may be betraying by the very language he uses is not a thought available to him. It is the aim of this book to make that thought available to radicals, liberals, and conservatives alike. I cannot, however, expect to make it palatable, for, if it is true, we are all already in a state so disastrous that there are no large remedies for it. Do not, however, suppose that the conclusion to be drawn will turn out to be one of despair. Angst is an intermittently fashionable emotion, and the misreading of some existentialist texts has turned despair itself into a kind of psychological nostrum. But if we are indeed in as bad a state as I take us to be, pessimism, too, will turn out to be one more cultural luxury that we shall have to dispense with in order to survive in these hard times. I cannot, of course, deny, indeed my thesis entails, that the language and the appearances of morality persist, even though the integral substance of morality has to a large degree been fragmented and then in part destroyed. Because of this, there is no inconsistency in my speaking, as I shall shortly do, of contemporary moral attitudes and arguments. I merely pay to the present the courtesy of using its own vocabulary to speak of it. Chapter 2. The nature of moral disagreement today, and the claims of Emotivism. The most striking feature of contemporary moral utterance is that so much of it is used to express disagreements. And the most striking feature of the debates in which these disagreements are expressed is their interminable character. I do not mean by this just that such debates go on and on and on, although they do, but also that they apparently can find no terminus. There seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture. Consider 3 examples of just such contemporary moral debate framed in terms of characteristic and well-known rival moral arguments. They are as follows. 1. A just war is one in which the good to be achieved outweighs the evils involved in waging the war, and in which a clear distinction can be made between combatants whose lives are at stake and innocent non-combatants. But in modern war, calculation of future escalation is never reliable, and no practically applicable distinction between combatants and non-combatants can be made. Therefore, no modern war can be a just war, and we all now ought to be pacifists. B. If you wish for peace, prepare for war. The only way to achieve peace is to deter potential aggressors. Therefore, you must build up your armaments and make it clear that going to war on any particular scale is not necessarily ruled out by your policies. An inescapable part of making this clear is being prepared both to fight limited wars and to go not only to, but beyond the nuclear brink on certain types of occasion. Otherwise, you will not avoid war, and you will be defeated. C. Wars between the great powers are purely destructive. But wars waged to liberate oppressed groups, especially in the Third World, are necessary and therefore justified means for destroying the exploitative domination which stands between mankind and happiness. Debate 2. A. Everybody has certain rights over his or her own person, including his or her own body. It follows from the nature of these rights that at the stage when the embryo is essentially part of the mother's body, the mother has a right to make her own uncoerced decisions on whether she will have an abortion or not. Therefore, abortion is morally permissible and ought to be allowed by law. B. I cannot will that my mother should have had an abortion when she was pregnant with me, except perhaps if it had been certain that the embryo was dead or gravely damaged. But if I cannot will this in my own case, how can I consistently deny to others the right to life that I claim for myself? I would break the so-called golden rule unless I denied that a mother has in general a right to an abortion. I am not, of course, thereby committed to the view that abortion ought to be legally prohibited. C. Murder is wrong. Murder is the taking of innocent life. An embryo is an identifiable individual differing from a newborn infant only in being at an earlier stage on the long road to adult capacities, and, if any life is innocent, that of an embryo is. If infanticide is murder, as it is, abortion is murder. So abortion is not only morally wrong, but ought to be legally prohibited. Debate 3. A. Justice demands that every citizen should enjoy, so far as is possible, an equal opportunity to develop his or her talents and his or her other potentialities. But prerequisites for this provision of such equal opportunity include the provision of equal access to health care and to education. Therefore, justice requires the governmental provision of health and educational services, financed out of taxation, and it also requires that no citizen should be able to buy an unfair share of such services. This in turn requires the abolition of private schools and private medical practice. B. Everyone has a right to incur such and only such obligations as he or she wishes, to be free to make such and only such contracts as he or she desires, and to determine his or her own free choices. Physicians must therefore be free to practice on such terms as they desire, and patients must be free to choose among physicians. Teachers must be free to teach on such terms as they choose, and pupils and parents to go where they wish for education. Freedom thus requires not only the existence of private practice in medicine and private schools in education, but also the abolition of those restraints on private practice which are imposed by licensing and regulation by bodies such as universities, medical schools, the American Medical Association, and the state. These arguments have only to be stated to be recognized as being widely influential in our society. They have, of course, their articulate expert spokesmen. Herman Kahn and the Pope, Che Guevara and Milton Friedman are among the authors who have produced variant versions of them. But it is their appearance in newspaper editorials and high school debates, on radio talk shows and letters to congressmen, in bars, barracks, and boardrooms. It is their typicality that makes them important examples here. What salient characteristic do these debates and disagreements share? They are of three kinds. The first is what I shall call, adapting an expression from the philosophy of science, the conceptual incommensurability of the rival arguments in each of the three debates. Every one of the arguments is logically valid or can be easily expanded so as to be made so. The conclusions do indeed follow from the premises, but the rival premises are such that we possess no rational way of weighing the claims of one as against another, for each premise employs some quite different normative or evaluative concept from the others, so that the claims made upon us are of quite different kinds. In the first argument, for example, premises which invoke justice and innocence are at odds with premises which invoke success and survival. In the second, premises which invoke rights are at odds with those which invoke universalizability. In the third, it is the claim of an equality that is matched against that of liberty. It is precisely because there is in our society no established way of deciding between these claims that moral argument appears to be necessarily interminable. From our rival conclusions, we can argue back to our rival premises. But when we do arrive at our premises, argument ceases, and the invocation of one premise against another becomes a matter of pure assertion and counter-assertion. Hence, perhaps the slightly shrill tone of so much moral debate. But that shrillness may have an additional source, for it is not only in arguments with others that we are reduced so quickly to assertion and counter-assertion. It is also in the arguments that we have within ourselves. For whenever an argument enters the forum of public debate, whenever an agent enters the forum of public debate, he has already presumably, explicitly or implicitly settled the matter in question in his own mind. Yet, if we possess no unassailable criteria, no set of compelling reasons by means of which we may conceive our opponents, it follows that in the process of making up our own minds, we can have made no appeal to such criteria or such reasons. If I lack any good reasons to invoke against you, it must seem that I lack any good reasons. Hence, it seems that underlying my own position there must be some non-rational decision to adopt that position. Corresponding to the interminability of public argument, there is at least the appearance of a disquieting private arbitrariness. It is small wonder if we become defensive and therefore shrill. A second, equally important, but contrasting characteristic of these arguments is that they do nonetheless purport to be impersonal rational arguments, and as such are usually presented in a mode appropriate to that impersonality. What is that mode? Consider two different ways in which I may provoke backing for an injunction to someone else to perform some specific action. In the first type of case, I say, do so-and-so. The person addressed replies, why should I do so-and-so? I reply, because I wish it. Here I have given the person addressed no reason to do what I command or request unless he or she independently possesses some particular reason for paying regard to my wishes. If I am your superior officer in the police, say, or the army, or otherwise have power or authority over you, or if you love me, or fear me, or want something from me, then by saying, because I wish it, I have indeed given you a reason, although not perhaps a sufficient reason, for doing what it is that I enjoin. Notice that in this type of case, whether my utterance gives you a reason or not depends on certain characteristics possessed at the time of hearing, or otherwise learning of the utterance by you. What reason-giving force the injunction has depends in this way on the personal context of the utterance. Contrast this with the type of case which the answer to the question, why should I do so-and-so, after someone has said do so-and-so, is not because I wish it, but because such utterance as, because it would give pleasure to a number of people, or because it is your duty. In this type of case, the reason given for action either is or is not a good reason for performing the action in question, independently of who utters it, or even of whether it is uttered at all. Moreover, the appeal is to a type of consideration which is independent of the relationship between speaker and hearer. Its use presupposes the existence of impersonal criteria, the existence independently of the preferences or attitudes of speaker and hearer, of standards of justice or generosity or duty. The particular link between the context of utterance and the force of the reason-giving which always holds in the case of expressions of personal preferences or desire is severed in the case of moral and other evaluative utterances. This second characteristic of contemporary moral utterance and argument, when combined with the first, imparts a paradoxical air to contemporary moral disagreement. For if we attended solely to the first characteristic, to the way in which what at first appears to be argument relapses so quickly into unargued disagreement, we might conclude that there is nothing to such contemporary disagreements but a clash of antagonistic wills, each will determined by some set of arbitrary choices of its own. But this second characteristic, the use of expressions whose distinctive function in our language is to embody what purports to be an appeal to objective standards, suggests otherwise. For even if the surface appearance of argument is only a masquerade, the question remains, why this masquerade? What is it about rational argument which is so important that it is the nearly universal appearance assumed by those who engage in moral conflict? Does not this suggest that the practice of moral argument in our culture expresses at least an aspiration to be or to become rational in this area of our lives? The third salient characteristic of contemporary moral debate is intimately related to the first two. It is easy to see that the different conceptually incommensurable premises of the rival arguments deployed in these debates have a wide variety of historical origins. The concept of justice in the first argument has its roots in Aristotle's account of the virtues. The second argument's genealogy runs through Bismarck and Clausewitz to Machiavelli. The concept of liberation in the third argument has shallow roots in Marx, deeper roots in Fichte. In the second debate, a concept of rights which has Lockean antecedents is matched against a view of universalizability which is recognizably Kantian and has an appeal to the moral law which is Thomist. In the third debate, an argument which owes debts to T.H. Green and to Rousseau competes with one which has Adam Smith as a grandfather. This catalogue of great names is suggestive, but it may be misleading in two ways. The citing of individual names may lead us to underestimate the complexity of the history and the ancestry of such arguments, and it may lead us to look for that history and that ancestry only in the writings of philosophers and theorists, instead of in those intricate bodies of theory and practice which constitute human cultures, the beliefs of which are articulated by philosophers and theorists only in a partial and selective manner. But the catalogue of names does suggest how wide and heterogeneous the variety of moral sources is from which we have inherited. The surface rhetoric of our culture is apt to speak complacently of moral pluralism in this connection, but the notion of pluralism is too imprecise, for it may equally apply to an ordered dialogue of intersecting viewpoints and to an unharmonious melange of ill-assorted fragments. The suspicion, and for the moment it can only be a suspicion, that it is the latter with which we have to deal, is heightened when we recognize that all those various concepts which inform our moral discourse were originally at home in larger totalities of theory and practice, in which they entered a role and function supplied by contexts of which they have now been deprived. Moreover, the concepts we employ have in at least some cases changed their character in the past 300 years. The evaluative expressions we use have changed their meanings. In the transition from the variety of contexts in which they were originally at home to our own contemporary culture, the terms virtue and the terms justice and piety and duty and even ought have become other than they once were. How ought we to write the history of such changes? It is in trying to answer this question that the connection between these features of contemporary moral debate and my initial hypothesis becomes clear. For if I am right in supposing that the language of morality passed from a state of order to a state of disorder, this passage will surely be rejected, in part, indeed, will actually consist in just such changes of meaning. Moreover, if the characteristics of our own moral arguments which I have identified, most notably the fact that we simultaneously and inconsistently treat moral arguments as an exercise of our rational powers and as a mere expressive assertion, are symptoms of moral disorder, we ought to be able to construct a true historical narrative in which, at an earlier stage, moral argument is very different in kind. Can we? One obstacle to our doing so has been the persistently unhistorical treatment of moral philosophy by contemporary philosophers in both the writing about and the teaching of the subject. We all too often still treat the moral philosophers of the past as contributors to a single debate with a relatively unvarying subject matter, treating Plato and Hume and Mill as contemporaries both of ourselves and of each other. This leads to an abstraction of these writers from the cultural and social milieus in which they lived and thought, as so the history of their thought acquires a false independence from the rest of the culture. Kant ceases to be part of the history of Prussia. Hume is no longer a Scotsman. For from the standpoint of moral philosophy, as we conceive it, these characteristics have become irrelevances. Empirical history is one thing, philosophy quite another. But are we right in understanding the division between academic disciplines in the way that we conventionally do? Once again, there seems to be a possible relationship between the history of moral discourse and the history of the academic curriculum. Yet, at this point, it may rightly be retorted. You keep speaking of possibilities, of suspicions, of hypotheses. You allow that what you are suggesting will initially seem implausible. You are in this at least right, for all this resort to conjectures about history is unnecessary. The way in which you have stated the problem is misleading. Contemporary moral argument is rationally interminable because all moral, indeed all evaluative argument is and always must be rationally interminable. Contemporary moral disagreements of a certain kind cannot be resolved because no moral disagreements of that kind in any age, past, present, or future, can be resolved. What you present is a contingent feature of our culture, standing in need of some special, perhaps historical explanation, is a necessary feature of all cultures which possess evaluative discourse. This is a challenge which cannot be avoided at an early stage in this argument. Can it be defeated? One philosophical theory which this challenge specifically invites us to confront is Emotivism. Emotivism is the doctrine that all evaluative judgments, and more specifically all judgments, are nothing but expressions of preference, expressions of attitude or feeling, insofar as they are moral or evaluative in character. Particular judgments may, of course, unite moral and factual elements. Arson being destructive of property is wrong, unites the factual judgment that arson destroys property with the moral judgment that arson is wrong. But the moral element in such a judgment is always to be sharply distinguished from the factual. Factual judgments are true or false, and in the realm of fact there are rational criteria by means of which we may secure agreement as to what is true and what is false. But moral judgments, being expressions of attitude or feeling, are neither true nor false, and agreement in moral judgment is not to be secured by any rational method, for there are none. It is to be secured, if at all, by producing certain non-rational effects on the emotions or attitudes of those who disagree with us. We use moral judgments not only to express our own feelings and attitudes, but also precisely to produce such effects in others. Emotivism is thus a theory which professes to give an account of all value judgments whatsoever. Clearly, if it is true, all moral disagreement is rationally interminable. And clearly, if that is true, then certain of the features of contemporary moral debate to which I drew attention earlier do indeed have nothing to do with what is specifically contemporary. But is it true? Emotivism has been presented by its most sophisticated protagonists hitherto as a theory about the meaning of the sentences which are used to make moral judgments. C.L. Stevenson, the single most important exponent of the theory, asserted that the sentence, "This is good," means roughly the same as, "I approve of this, do so as well," trying to capture by this equivalence both the function of the moral judgment as expressive of the speaker's attitudes and the function of the moral judgment as designated to influence the hearer's attitudes. Other emotivists suggested that to say, "This is good," was to utter a sentence meaning roughly, "Hurrah for this." But as a theory of the meaning of a certain type of sentence, emotivism plainly fails, for at least three different reasons. The first is that, if the theory is to elucidate the meaning of a certain class of sentences by referring to their function, when uttered, of expressing feelings or attitudes, an essential part of the theory will have to consist in an identification and characterization of the feelings or attitudes in question. On this subject, proponents of the emotive theory are in general silent, and perhaps wisely, for all attempts so far to identify the relevant types of feelings or attitudes have found it impossible to avoid an empty circularity. Moral judgments express feelings or attitudes, it is said. What kind of feelings or attitudes, we ask. Feelings or attitudes or of approval is the reply. What kind of approval, we ask, perhaps remarking that approval is of many kinds. It is in answer to this question that every version of emotivism either remains silent, or by identifying the relevant kind of approval as moral approval, that is, the type of approval expressed by a specifically moral judgment, becomes vacuously circular. It becomes easy to understand why the theory is vulnerable to this first type of criticism, if we consider two other reasons for rejecting it. One is that emotivism, as a theory of the meaning of a certain type of sentence, is engaged in an impossible task from the beginning, because it is dedicated to characterizing as equivalent in meaning two kinds of expression which, as we have already seen, derive their distinctive function in our language in key part from the contrast and difference between them. I have already suggested that there are good reasons for distinguishing between what I called expressions of personal preference and evaluative, including moral expressions, citing the way in which utterances of the first kind depend upon who utters them, to whom, for any reason-giving force that they may have, while utterances of the second kind are not similarly dependent for their reason-giving force on the context of utterance. This seems sufficient to show that there is some large difference in meaning between members of the two classes, yet the emotive theory wishes to make them equivalent in meaning. This is not just a mistake. It is a mistake that demands explanation. A sign of where explanation should be sought is found in a third defect of the emotive theory, considered as a theory of meaning. The emotive theory, as we have seen, purports to be a theory about the meaning of sentences, but the expression of feelings or attitudes is characteristically a function not of the meaning of sentences, but of their use on particular occasions. The angry schoolmaster, to use one of Gilbert Ryle's examples, may vent his feelings by shouting at the small boy who has just made an arithmetical mistake. 7 times 7 equals 49. But the use of this sentence to express feelings or attitudes has nothing whatsoever to do with its meaning. This suggests that we should not simply rely on these objections to reject the emotive theory, but that we should rather consider whether it ought not to have been proposed as a theory about the use, understood as purpose or function, of members of a certain class of expressions, rather than about their meaning, understood as including all that Frege intended by sense, by the term sense and the term reference. Clearly, the argument so far shows that when someone utters a moral judgment, such as "this is right" or "this is good," it does not mean the same as "I approve of this, do so as well," or "hurrah for this," or any of the other attempts at equivalence suggested by emotive theorists. But even if the meaning of such sentences were quite other than emotive theorists supposed, it might be plausibly claimed, if the evidence was adequate, that in using such sentences to say whatever they mean, the agent was in fact doing nothing more than expressing his feelings or attitudes and attempting to influence the feelings and attitudes of others. If the emotive theory thus interpreted were correct, it would follow that the meaning and the use of moral expressions were, or at the very least had become, radically discrepant with each other. Meaning and use would be at odds in such a way that meaning would tend to conceal use. We could not safely infer what someone who uttered a moral judgment was doing merely by listening to what he said. Moreover, the agent himself might well be among those for whom use was concealed by meaning. He might well, precisely because he was self-conscious about the meaning of the words that he used, be assured that he was appealing to independent impersonal criteria, when all that he was in fact doing was expressing his feelings to others in a manipulative way. How might such a phenomena come to occur? Let us, in the light of such considerations, disregard Emotivism's claim to universality of scope, and let us instead consider Emotivism as a theory which has been advanced in historically specific conditions. In the 18th century, Hume embodied emotivist elements in the large and complex fabric of his total moral theory. But it is only in this century that Emotivism has flourished as a theory on its own. And it did so as a response to a set of theories which flourished, especially in England, between 1903 and 1939. We ought therefore to ask whether Emotivism, as a theory, may not have been both a response to, and in the very first instance, an account of not, as its protagonists indeed supposed, moral language as such, but moral language in England in the years after 1903, and as and when that language was interpreted in accordance with that body of theory to the refutation of which Emotivism was primarily dedicated. The theory in question borrowed from the early 19th century the name of Intuitionism, and its immediate progenitor was G.E. Moore. I went up to Cambridge at Michaelmas, 1902, and Moore's Principia Ethica came out at the end of my first year. It was exciting, exhilarating, the beginning of a renaissance, the opening of a new heaven on a new earth. So wrote John Maynard Keynes, quoted in Rosenbaum 1975, page 52, and so, in their own rhetorical modes, Lytton Strachey and Desmond McCarthy and later Virginia Woolf, who struggled through Principia Ethica page by page in 1908, and a whole network of Cambridge and London friends and acquaintances. What opened the new heaven was Moore's quiet but apocalyptic proclamation in 1903 that after many centuries he had at last solved the problems of ethics by being the first philosopher to attend with sufficient care to the precise nature of the questions which it is the task of ethics to answer. What Moore believed that he had discovered by attending to the precise nature of these questions was threefold. First, that the term good is the name of a simple, indefinable property, a property different from that named by the term pleasant, or conducive to evolutionary survival, or any other natural property. Hence, Moore speaks of good as a non-natural property. Propositions declaring this or that to be good are what Moore called so-called intuitions. They are incapable of proof or disproof, and indeed no evidence or reasoning whatsoever can be adduced in their favor or disfavor. Although Moore disclaims any use of the word intuition, which might suggest the name of a faculty of intuition comparable to our power of vision, he nonetheless does compare good as a property with yellow as a property in such a way as to make verdicts that a given state of affairs is or is not comparable to the simplest judgments of normal visual perception. Secondly, Moore takes it that to call an action right is simply to say that of the available alternative actions, it is the one which does or did, as a matter of fact, produce the most good. Moore is thus a utilitarian. Every action is to be evaluated solely by its consequences, as compared with the consequences of alternative possible courses of action. And, as with at least some other versions of utilitarianism, it follows that no action is ever right or wrong as such. Anything whatsoever may, under certain circumstances, be permitted. Thirdly, it turns out to be the case, in the 6th and final chapter of Principia Ethica, that personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest, and by far the greatest goods we can imagine. This is the ultimate and fundamental truth of moral philosophy. The achievement of friendship and the contemplation of what is beautiful in nature or in art becomes certainly almost the sole and perhaps the sole justifiable ends of all human action. We ought to notice immediately two crucial facts about Moore's moral theory. The first is that his three central positions are logically independent of each other. There would be no breach in consistency if one were to affirm any one of the three and to deny the other two. One can be an intuitionist without being a utilitarian. Most English intuitionists came to hold the view that there was a non-natural property of right as well as of good, and held that to perceive that a certain type of action was right was to see that one had at least a prima facie obligation to perform that type of action independently of its consequences. Likewise, a utilitarian has no necessary commitment to intuitionism, and neither utilitarians nor intuitionists have any necessary commitment to the values of More's sixth chapter. The second crucial fact is easy to see retrospectively. The first part of what More says is plainly false, and the second and third parts are, at the very least, highly contentious. More's arguments at times are, it must seem now, obviously defective. He tries to show that the term good is indefinable, for example, by relying on a bad dictionary definition of the term definition, and a great deal is asserted rather than argued. And yet it is this to us plainly false, badly argued position which Keynes treated as, quote, the beginning of a renaissance, which Lytton Strachey declared to have shattered all writers on ethics, from Aristotle and Christ to Herbert Spencer and Mr. Bradley, and which Leonard Woolf described as substituting for the religious and philosophical nightmares, delusions, hallucinations in which Jehovah, Christ, and St. Paul, Plato, Kant, and Hegel had entangled us, the fresh air and pure light of common sense, quoted in Gad, 1974. This is great silliness, of course, but it is the great silliness of highly intelligent and perceptive people. It is therefore worth asking if we can discern any clues as to why they accepted More's naive and complacent apocalypticism. One suggests itself. It is that the group who were to become Bloomsbury had already accepted the values of More's sixth chapter, but could not accept these as merely their own personal preferences. They felt the need to find objective and impersonal justifications for rejecting all claims except those of personal intercourse and of the beautiful. What specifically were they rejecting? Not, in fact, the doctrines of Plato or St. Paul or any other of the great names in Woolf's or Strachey's catalogue of deliverance, but those names as symbols of the culture of the late 19th century. Sedgwick and Leslie Stephen are being dismissed along with Spencer and Bradley, and the whole of the past is envisioned as a burden that More has just helped them cast off. What was it about the moral culture of the late 19th century which made it a burden to be escaped from? That is a question to which an answer ought to be deferred, precisely because it is going to be forced on us more than once in the course of the argument, and later on we shall be better equipped to answer it. But we ought to notice how dominant the theme of that rejection is in the lives and writings of the Woolfs, of Lytton Strachey, of Roger Fry. Keynes emphasized the rejection not only of the Benthamite version of utilitarianism and of Christianity, but of all claims on behalf of social action conceived as a worthwhile end. What was left? The answer is a highly impoverished view of how the term good may be used. Keynes gives examples of central topics of discussion among More's followers. They are as follows. If A was in love with B, and believed that B reciprocated his feelings, whereas in fact B did not, but was in love with C, the state of affairs was certainly not as good as it would have been if A had been right, but was it worse or better than it would become if A discovered his mistake? Or again, as follows. If A was in love with B under a misapprehension as to B's qualities, was this better or worse than A's not being in love at all? How were such questions to be answered? By following More's prescriptions in precise fashion. Do you Or do you not discern the presence or absence of the non-natural property of good in greater or lesser degree? And what if two observers disagree? Then, so the answer went, according to Keynes, either the two were focusing on different subject matters without recognizing this, or had perceptions superior to the other. But of course, as Keynes tells us, what was really happening was something quite other. In practice, victory was with those who could speak with the greatest appearance of clear, undoubting conviction, and could best use the accents of infallibility. And Keynes goes on to describe the effectiveness of More's grasp of incredulity and head-shaking, of Stochley's grim silences, and of Low's Dickensian shrugs. There is evident here precisely that gap between the meaning and purport of what was being said and the use to which utterance was being put, to which our reinterpretation of emotivism drew attention. An acute observer at the time, and Keynes himself retrospectively, might well have put matters thus, that is, these people take themselves to be identifying the presence of a non-natural property, which they call by the term good, but there is in fact no such property, and they are doing no more and no other than expressing their feelings and attitudes, disguising the expression of preference and whim by an interpretation of their own utterance and behavior, which confers upon it an objectivity that it does not in fact possess. It is, I take it, no accident that the acutest of the modern founders of emotivism, philosophers such as F.P. Ramsey in the Epilogue to the Foundations of Mathematics, Austin Duncan Jones, and C.L. Stevenson were pupils of More. It is not implausible to suppose that they did in fact confuse moral utterances at Cambridge and in other places with a similar inheritance after 1903, with moral utterances as such, and that they therefore presented what was in essentials a correct account of the former, as though it were an account of the latter. More's followers had behaved as if their disagreements over what is good were being settled by an appeal to an objective and impersonal criterion. But in fact the stronger and psychologically more adroit will was prevailing. It is unsurprising that emotivists sharply distinguished between factual, including perceptual disagreements, and what Stevenson called disagreements in attitude. But if the claims of emotivism, understood as claims about the use of moral utterances at Cambridge after 1903 and its heirs and successors in London and elsewhere, rather than about the meaning of moral expressions at all times and places, seem remarkably cogent, it turns out to be for reasons which at first sight seem to undermine emotivism's universal claims, and with them emotivism's apparent threat to my original thesis. What makes emotivism convincing as a thesis about a certain kind of moral utterance at Cambridge after 1903 are certain features specific to that historical episode. Those who evaluate utterances embodied More's interpretations of those utterances could not have been doing what they took themselves to be doing because of the falsity of More's thesis. But nothing whatsoever seems to follow about moral utterances in general. Emotivism on this account turns out to be an empirical thesis, or rather, a preliminary sketch of an empirical thesis presumably to be filled out later by psychological and sociological and historical observations about those who continue to use moral and other evaluative expressions as if they were governed by objective and impersonal criteria, when all grasp of any such criterion has been lost. We should therefore expect emotivist types of theory to arise in a specific local circumstance as a response to types of theory and practice which share certain key features of More's intuitionism. Emotivism, thus understood, turns out to be, as a cogent theory of use rather than a false theory of meaning, connected with one specific stage in moral development or decline, a stage which our own culture entered early in the present century. I spoke earlier of emotivism as an account not only of moral utterance at Cambridge after 1903, but also of moral utterance in other places with a similar inheritance. For it at once might be objected to my thesis that emotivism has been, after all, propounded in a variety of times, places, and circumstances, and hence that my stress upon More's part in generating emotivism is mistaken. To this I should reply first that I am interested in emotivism only insofar as it has been a plausible and defensible thesis. Carnap's version of emotivism, for example, in which the characterization of moral utterances as expressions of feeling or attitude is a desperate attempt to find some status for them after his theory of meaning and his theory of science have expelled them from the realm of the factual and the descriptive, was based on the most meager attention to their specific character. And secondly, I should retort that there is an Oxford history beginning from Pritchard's intuitionism to parallel More's Cambridge history, and indeed that wherever something like emotivism is found to flourish, it generally is the successor theory to views analogous to More or Pritchard's. The scheme of moral decline which these remarks presuppose would, as I suggested earlier, be one which required the discrimination of three distinct stages. A first, at which evaluative, and more especially moral theory and practice embody genuine, objective, and impersonal standards which provide rational justification for particular policies, actions, and judgments, and which themselves in turn are susceptible of rational justification. A second stage, at which there are unsuccessful attempts to maintain the objectivity and impersonality of moral judgments, but during which the project of providing rational justifications, both by means of and for the standards, continuously breaks down, and a third stage at which theories of an emotivist kind secure wide implicit acceptance because of a general implicit recognition in practice, though not in explicit theory, that claims to objectivity and impersonality cannot be made good. The very statement of this scheme is enough to suggest that the general claims of emotivism, represented as a theory of use, cannot be so easily put on one side. For a presupposition of the scheme of development which I have just sketched is that genuine, objective, and impersonal moral standards can, in some way or other, be rationally justified, even if in some cultures, at some stages, the possibility of such rational justifications is no longer available. And this is what emotivism denies. What I have suggested to be the case, by and large, about our own culture, that in moral argument the apparent assertion of principles functions as a mask for the expressions of personal preference, is what emotivism takes to be universally the case. Moreover, it does so on grounds which require no general historical and sociological investigation of human cultures. For what emotivism asserts is, in central part, that there are and can be no valid rational justification for any claims that objective and impersonal moral standards exist, and hence that there are no such standards. Its claim is of the same order as the claim that it is true of all cultures whatsoever that they lack witches. Purported witches there may be, but real witches there cannot have been, for there are none. So emotivism holds that purported rational justifications there may be, but real rational justifications there cannot have been, for there are none. Emotivism thus rests upon a claim that every attempt, whether past or present, to provide a rational justification for an objective morality has in fact failed. It is a verdict upon the whole history of moral philosophy, and as such obliterates the contrast between the present and the past embodied in my initial hypothesis. What emotivism, however, did fail to reckon with is the difference that it would make to morality if emotivism were not only true, but also widely believed to be true. Stevenson, for example, understood very clearly that saying, "I disapprove of this, do so as well," does not have the same force as saying, "This is bad." He noted that a kind of prestige attaches to the latter, which does not attach to the former. What he did not note, however, precisely because he viewed emotivism as a theory of meaning, is that the prestige derives from the fact that the use of "that is bad" implies an appeal to an objective and impersonal standard in a way in which "I disapprove of this, do so as well" does not. That is, if and insofar as emotivism is true, moral language is seriously misleading, and if and insofar as emotivism is justifiably believed, presumably the use of traditional and inherited moral language ought to be abandoned. This conclusion none of the emotivists drew, and it is clear that, like Stevenson, they failed to draw it because they misconstrued their own theory as a theory of meaning. This is also, of course, why emotivism did not prevail within analytical moral philosophy. Analytical philosophers had defined the central task of philosophy as that of deciphering the meaning of key expressions in both everyday and scientific languages, and since emotivism fails precisely as a theory of the meaning of moral expressions, analytical philosophers by and large rejected emotivism. Yet, emotivism did not die, and it is important to note how often, in widely different modern philosophical contexts, something very like emotivism's attempted reduction of morality to personal preference continually recurs in the writings of those who do not think of themselves as emotivists. The unrecognized philosophical power of emotivism is one clue to its cultural power. Within analytical moral philosophy, the resistance to emotivism has arisen from the perception that moral reasoning does occur, and that there can be logical linkages between various moral judgments of a kind that emotivism itself could not allow for. Therefore, and if then, are obviously not used as expressions of feeling. Yet, the most influential account of moral reasoning that emerged in response to this critique of emotivism was one to which an agent can only justify a particular judgment by referring to some universal rule from which it may be logically derived, and can only justify that rule in turn by deriving it from some more general rule or principle. But on this view, since every train of reasoning must be finite, such a process of justificatory reasoning must always terminate with the assertion of some rule or principle for which no further reason can be given. Thus, a complete justification of a decision would consist of a complete account of its effects, together with a complete account of the principles which it observed, and the effect of observing those principles. If the inquirer still goes on to ask, "But why should I live like that?" then there is no further answer to give him, because we have already ex hypothesi said everything that could be included in the further answer. From Hare, 1952, page 69. The terminus of justification is thus always, on this view, not further to be justified choice, a choice unguided by criteria. Each individual implicitly or explicitly has to adopt his or her own first principles on the basis of such a choice. The utterance of any universal principle is, in the end, an expression of the preferences of an individual will, and for that will its principles have, and can have only such authority as it chooses to confer upon them by adopting them. Thus, emotivism has not been left very far behind after all. To this it might well be replied that I am only able to reach this conclusion by omitting to notice the wide variety of positive positions incompatible with emotivism taken within analytical moral philosophy. Such writing has characteristically been preoccupied with attempts to show that the notion of rationality itself supplies morality with a basis, and a basis such that we have adequate grounds for rejecting emotivist and subjectivist accounts. Consider, it will be said, the variety of claims advanced not only by Hare, but also by Rawls, Donegan, Gert, and Gewerth, to name only a few. About the arguments which are adduced in support of such claims, I want to make 2 points. The first is that none of them in fact succeed. I shall later on, in Chapter 6, use Gewirth's argument as an exemplary case. He is to date the latest of such writers. He is self-consciously and scrupulously aware of the contributions of other analytical moral philosophers to the debate, and his arguments therefore provide us with an ideal test case. If they do not succeed, that is strong evidence that the project of which they are a part is not going to succeed, and as I shall show later, they do not succeed. Secondly, it is very much to the point that such writers cannot agree among themselves either on what the character of moral rationality is, or on the substance of the morality which is to be founded on that rationality. The diversity of contemporary moral debate and its interminability are indeed mirrored in the controversies of analytical and moral philosophers, but if those who claim to be able to formulate principles on which rational moral agents ought to agree cannot secure agreement on the foundation of those principles from their colleagues who share their basic philosophical purpose and method, there is once again prima facie evidence that their project has failed, even before we have examined their particular contentions and conclusions. Each of them in his criticism offers testimony to the failure of his colleagues' constructions. I therefore take it that we have no good reason to believe that analytical philosophy can provide any convincing escape from an emotivism, the substance of which it so often in fact concedes, once that emotivism is understood as a theory of use rather than meaning. But it is not only analytical moral philosophy of which this is true. It also holds of certain, at first sight, very different moral philosophies in Germany and France. Nietzsche and Sartre deploy philosophical vocabularies which are in large part alien to the English-speaking philosophical world, and in style and rhetoric as well as in vocabulary, each differs from the other as much as from analytical philosophy. Nonetheless, when Nietzsche sought to indict the making of would-be objective moral judgments as the mask worn by the will to power of those too weak and slavish to assert themselves with archaic and aristocratic grandeur, and when Sartre tried to exhibit the bourgeois rationalist morality of the Third Republic as an exercise in bad faith by those who cannot tolerate the recognition of their own choices as the sole source of moral judgment, both conceded the substance of that for which emotivism contended. Both indeed saw themselves as by their analysis condemning conventional morality, while most English and American emotivists believe themselves to be doing no such thing. Both saw their own task as in part that of founding a new morality, but in the writings of both, it is at this point that their rhetoric, very different as each is from the other, becomes cloudy and opaque, and metaphorical assertion replaces argument. The Übermensch and the Sartrean existentialist cum Marxist belongs to the pages of a philosophical bestiary rather than in serious discussion. Both, by contrast, are at their philosophically most powerful and cogent in the negative part of their critiques. The appearance of emotivism in this variety of philosophical guises suggests strongly that it is indeed in terms of a confrontation with emotivism that my own thesis must be defined, for one way of framing my contention that morality is not what it once was is just to say that to a large degree people now think, talk, and act as if emotivism were true, no matter what their avowed theoretical standpoint may be. Emotivism has become embodied in our culture, but of course, in saying this, I am not merely contending that morality is not what it once was, but also, and more importantly, that what once was morality has some large degree disappeared, and that this marks a degeneration, a grave cultural loss. I am therefore committed to two distinct but related tasks. The first is that of identifying and describing the loss of morality of the past and of evaluating its claims to objectivity and authority. This is a task partly historical and partly philosophical. The second is that of making good my claim about the specific character of the modern age, for I have suggested that we live in a specifically emotivist culture, and if this is so, we ought presumably to discover that a wide variety of our concepts and modes of behavior, and not only our explicitly moral debates and judgments, presuppose the truth of emotivism, if not at the level of self-conscious theorizing, at least in everyday practice. But is this so? To this latter issue, I turn immediately. Chapter 3. Emotivism, Social Content and Social Context. A moral philosophy, and emotivism is no exception, characteristically presupposes a sociology. For every moral philosophy offers explicitly or implicitly at least a partial conceptual analysis of the relationship of an agent to his or her reasons, motives, intentions, and actions, and in so doing generally presupposes some claim that even these concepts are embodied, or at least can be, in the real social world. Even Kant, who sometimes seems to restrict moral agency to the inner realm of the noumenal, implies otherwise in his writings on law, history, and politics. Thus, it would generally be a decisive refutation of a moral philosophy to show that moral agency on its own account of the matter could never be socially embodied, and it also follows that we have not yet fully understood the claims of any moral philosophy until we have spelled out what its social embodiment would be. Some moral philosophers in the past, perhaps most, have understood this spelling out as itself one part of the task of moral philosophy. So it scarcely needs be said that Plato and Aristotle, so indeed also Hume and Adam Smith, but at least since more, the dominant narrow conception of moral philosophy has ensured that the moral philosophers could ignore this task, as notably do the philosophical proponents of emotivism. We therefore must perform it for them. So, what is the key to the social content of emotivism? It is the fact that emotivism entails the obliteration of any genuine distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations. Consider the contrast between, for example, Kantian ethics and emotivism on this point. For Kant, and a parallel point could be made about many earlier moral philosophers, the difference between a human relationship uninformed by morality and one so informed is precisely the difference between one in which each person treats the other primarily as a means to his or her ends and one in which each treats the other as an end. To treat someone else as an end is to offer them what I take to be good reasons for acting in one way rather than another, but to leave it to them to evaluate those reasons. It is to be unwilling to influence another except by reasons which that other he or she judges to be good. It is to appeal to impersonal criteria of the validity of which each rational agent must be his or her own judge. By contrast, to treat someone else as a means is to seek to make him or her an instrument of my purposes by adducing whatever influences or considerations will in fact be effective on this or that occasion. The generalizations of the sociology and psychology of persuasion are what I shall need to guide me, not the standards of a normative rationality. If emotivism is true, this distinction is illusory, for evaluative utterances can in the end have no point or use but the expression of my own feelings or attitudes and the transformation of the feelings and attitudes of others. I cannot genuinely appeal to impersonal criteria, for there are no impersonal criteria. I may think that I so appeal, and others may think that I so appeal, but these thoughts will always be mistakes. The sole reality of distinctively moral discourse is the attempt of one will to align the attitudes, feelings, preferences, and choices of another with its own. Others are always means, never ends. What, then, would the social world look like if seen with emotivist eyes? And what would the social world be like if the truth of emotivism came to be widely presupposed? The general form of the answer to these questions is now clear, but the social detail depends in part on the nature of particular social contexts. It will make a difference in what milieu and in the service of what particular and specific interests the distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations has been obliterated. William Gass has suggested that it was a principal concern of Henry James to examine the consequences of the obliteration of this distinction in the lives of a particular kind of rich European in the Portrait of a Lady. Gass, 1971, pages 181 to 90. That the novel turns out to be an investigation, in Gass's words, of what it means to be a consumer of persons, and of what it means to be a person consumed. The metaphor of consumption acquires its appropriateness from the milieu. James is concerned with rich aesthetes whose interest is to fend off the kind of boredom that is so characteristic of modern leisure by contriving behavior in others that will be responsive to their wishes, that will feed their sated appetites. Those wishes may or may not be benevolent, but the distinction between characters who entertain themselves by willing the good of others and those who pursue the fulfillment of their desires without a concern for any good but their own. The difference in the novel between Ralph Touchet and Gilbert Osmond is not as important to James as the distinction between a whole milieu in which the manipulative mode of moral instrumentalism has triumphed and one, such as the New England of the Europeans, of which this was not true. James was, of course, at least in the Portrait of a Lady, concerned with only one restricted and carefully identified social milieu, with a particular kind of rich person at one particular time and place. But that does not at all diminish the importance of his achievement for this inquiry. It will, in fact, turn out that The Portrait of a Lady has a key place within a long tradition of moral commentary, earlier members of which are Diderot's Les Nouveaux de Rému and Kierkegaard's Enten Eller. That's Dutch, so it's not Enten Eller. Enten Eller. The unifying preoccupation of that tradition is the condition of those who see in the social world nothing but a meeting place for individual wills, each with its own set of attitudes and preferences, and who understand that world solely as an arena for the achievement of their own satisfaction, who interpret reality as a series of opportunities for their enjoyment, and for whom the last enemy is boredom. The younger Rému, Kierkegaard's A, and Ralph Touchet put this aesthetic attitude to work in very different environments. But the attitude is recognizably the same, and even the environments have something in common. They are environments in which the problem of enjoyment arises in the context of leisure, in which large sums of money have created some social distance from the necessity of work. Ralph Touchet is rich. A is comfortably off. Rému is a parasite upon his rich patrons and clients. This is not to say that the realm of which Kierkegaard called the aesthetic is restricted to the rich and to their close neighbors. The rest of us often share the attitudes of the rich in fantasy and aspiration. Nor is it to say that the rich are all Touchets or Osmonds or A's. But it is to suggest that if we are to understand fully the social context of that obliteration of the distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relationships which emotivism entails, we ought to consider some other social contexts too. One, which is obviously important, is that provided by the life of organizations of those bureaucratic structures which, whether in the form of private corporations or of government agencies, define the working tasks of so many of our contemporaries. One sharp contrast with the lives of the aesthetic rich secures immediate attention. The rich aesthete, with a plethora of means, searches restlessly for ends on which he may employ them. But the organization is characteristically engaged in a competitive struggle for scarce resources to put to the service of its predetermined ends. It is therefore a central responsibility of managers to direct and redirect their organization's available resources, both human and non-human, as effectively as possible towards those ends. Every bureaucratic organization embodies some explicit or implicit definition of costs and benefits from which the criteria of effectiveness are derived. Bureaucratic rationality is the rationality of matching means to ends economically and efficiently. This familiar, perhaps by now we may be tempted to think over-familiar, thought we owe originally, of course, to Max Weber. And it at once becomes relevant that Weber's thought embodies just those dichotomies which Emotivism embodies, and obliterates just those distinctions to which Emotivism has to be blind. Questions of ends are questions of values, and on values reason is silent. Conflict between rival values cannot be rationally settled. Instead, one must simply choose between parties, classes, nations, causes, ideals. Entscheidung plays the part in Weber's thought that choice of principles plays in that of Hare or Sartre. So-called values, says Raymond Aron in his exposition of Weber's view, are created by human decisions. And again he ascribes to Weber the view that each man's conscience is irrefutable, and that values rest on a choice whose justification is purely subjective. Aron, 1967, pages 206 through 10 and page 192. It is not surprising that Weber's understanding of values was indebted chiefly to Nietzsche, and that Donald G. McCrae, in his book on Weber, 1974, calls him an existentialist. For while he holds that an agent may be more or less rational in acting consistently with his values, the choice of any one particular evaluative stance or commitment can be no more rational than that of any other. All faiths and all evaluations are equally non-rational. All are subjective directions given to sentiment and feeling. Weber is then, in the broader sense in which I have understood the term, an emotivist, and his portrait of a bureaucratic authority is an emotivist portrait. The consequence of Weber's emotivism is that in his thought the contrast between power and authority, although paid lip service to, is effectively obliterated as a special instance of the disappearance of the contrast between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations. Weber, of course, took himself to be distinguishing power from authority precisely because authority serves ends, serves faiths. But as Philip Reif has acutely noted, Weber's ends, the causes there to be served, are means of acting. They cannot escape service to power. For on Weber's view, no type of authority can appeal to rational criteria to vindicate itself except that type of bureaucratic authority which appeals precisely to its own effectiveness. And what this appeal reveals is that bureaucratic authority is nothing other than successful power. Weber's general account of bureaucratic organizations has been subjected to much cogent criticism by sociologists who have analyzed the specific character of actual bureaucracies. It is therefore relevant to note that there is one area in which his analysis has been vindicated by experience, and in which accounts of many sociologists who take themselves to have repudiated Weber's analysis in fact reproduce it. I am referring precisely to his account of how managerial authority is justified in bureaucracies. For those modern sociologists who have put in the forefront of their accounts of managerial behavior aspects ignored or underemphasized by Weber's, as for example, Likert has emphasized the manager's need to influence the motives of his subordinates, and Marsh and Simon his need to ensure that those subordinates argue from premises which will produce agreement with his own prior conclusions, have still seen the manager's function as that of controlling behavior and suppressing conflict in such a way as to reinforce rather than to undermine Weber's account of managerial justification. Thus, there is a good deal of evidence that actual managers do embody in their behavior this one key part of the Weberian conception of bureaucratic authority, a conception which presupposes the truth of Emotivism. The original of the character of the rich man committed to the aesthetic pursuit of his own enjoyment as drawn by Henry James was to be found in London and Paris in the last century. The original of the character of the manager portrayed by Max Weber was at home in Wilhelmine, Germany, but both have by now been domesticated in all the advanced countries, and more especially in the United States. The two characters may even on occasion be found in one and the same person, who partitions his life between them. Nor are they marginal figures in the social drama of the present age. I intend this dramatic metaphor with some seriousness. There is a type of dramatic tradition. Japanese no plays and English medieval morality plays are examples, which possess a set of stock characters immediately recognizable to the audience. Such characters partially define the possibilities of plot and action. To understand them is to be provided with a means of interpreting the behavior of the actors who play them, just because a similar understanding informs the intentions of the actors themselves, and other actors may define their parts with special reference to these central characters. So it is also with certain kinds of social roles specific to certain particular cultures. They furnish recognizable characters, and the ability to recognize them is socially crucial because a knowledge of the character provides an interpretation of the actions of those individuals who have assumed the character. It does so precisely because those individuals have used the very same knowledge to guide and to structure their behavior. Characters, specified thus, must not be confused with social roles in general, for they are a very special type of social role which places a certain kind of moral constraint on the personality of those who inhabit them in a way in which many other social roles do not. I choose the word character for them precisely because of the way it links dramatic and moral associations. Many modern occupational roles, that of a dentist or that of a garbage collector, for example, are not characters in the way that of a bureaucratic manager is. Many modern status roles, that of a retired member of the lower middle class, for example, are not characters in the way that of the modern leisured rich person is. In the case of a character role and personality fuse in a more specific way than in general. In the case of a character, the possibilities of action are defined in a more limited way than in general. One of the key differences between cultures is in the extent to which roles are characters. But what is specific to each culture is in large and central part what is specific to its stock of characters. So the culture of Victorian England was partially defined by the characters of the public school headmaster, the explorer, and the engineer, and that of Wilhelmine Germany was similarly defined by such characters as those of the Prussian officer, the professor, and the social democrat. Characters have one other notable dimension. They are, so to speak, the moral representatives of their culture, and they are so because of the way in which moral and metaphysical ideas and theories assume through them an embodied existence in the social world. Characters are the mask worn by moral philosophies. Such theories, such philosophies do, of course, enter into social life in numerous ways. That is, most obviously perhaps as explicit ideas in books or sermons or conversations, or as symbolic themes in paintings or plays or dreams. But the distinctive way in which they inform the lives of characters can be illuminated by considering how characters merge what is usually thought to belong to the individual man or woman and what is usually thought to belong to social roles. Both individuals and roles can, and do, like characters, embody moral beliefs, doctrines, and theories, but each does so in its own way, and the way in which characters do so can only be sketched by contrast with these. It is by way of their intentions that individuals express bodies of moral belief in their actions. For all intentions presuppose more or less complex, more or less coherent, more or less explicit bodies of belief, sometimes of moral belief. So such small-scale actions as the mailing of a letter or the handing of a leaflet to a passerby can embody intentions whose import derives from some large-scale project of the individual, a project itself intelligible only against the background of some equally large or even larger scheme of beliefs. In mailing a letter, someone may be embarking on a type of entrepreneurial career whose specification requires belief in both the viability and the legitimacy of multinational corporations. That is, in handing out a leaflet, someone may be expressing his belief in Lenin's philosophy of history. But the chain of practical reasoning, whose conclusions are expressed in such actions as the mailing of a letter or the distribution of a leaflet, is in this type of case, of course, the individual's own. And the locus of that chain of reasoning, the context which makes the taking of each step part of an intelligible sequence, is that particular individual's history of action, belief, experience, and interaction. Contrast this the quite different way in which a certain type of social role may embody beliefs, so that the ideas, theories, and doctrines expressed and presupposed by the role may at least on some occasions be quite other than the ideas, theories, and doctrines believed by the individual who inhabits the role. A Catholic priest, in virtue of his role, officiates at the Mass, performs other rites and ceremonies, and takes part in a variety of activities which embody or presuppose, implicitly or explicitly, the beliefs of Catholic Christianity. Yet a particular ordained individual who does all these things may have lost his faith, and his own beliefs may be quite other than and at variance with those expressed in the actions presented by his role. The same type of distinction between role and individual can be drawn in many other cases. A trade union official, in virtue of his role, negotiates with employers' representatives and campaigns among his own membership in a way that generally and characteristically presupposes that trade union goals, higher wages, improvements in working conditions, and the maintenance of employment within the present economic system are legitimate goals for the working class, and that trade unions are the appropriate instruments for achieving those goals. Yet a particular trade union official may believe that trade unions are merely instruments for domesticating and corrupting the working class by diverting them from any interest in revolution. The beliefs that he has in his mind and heart are one thing. The beliefs that his role expresses and presupposes are quite another. There are then many cases where there is a certain distance between role and individual, and where consequently a variety of degrees of doubt, compromise, interpretation, or cynicism may mediate the relationship of individual to role. With what I have called characters, it is quite otherwise, and the difference arises from the fact that the requirements of a character are imposed from the outside, from the way in which others regard and use characters to understand and evaluate themselves. With other types of social role, the role may be adequately specified in terms of the institution of whose structures it is a part and the relation to those institutions of the individuals who fill the roles. In the case of a character, this is not enough. A character is an object of regard by the members of the culture generally or by some significant segment of them. He furnishes them with a cultural and moral ideal. Hence, the demand is that in this type of case, role and personality be fused. Social type and psychological type are required to coincide. The character morally legitimates a mode of social existence. It is, I hope, now clear why I picked the examples that I did when I referred to Victorian England and Wilhelmine Germany, the public school headmaster in England and the professor in Germany, to take only two examples, were not just social roles. They provided the moral focus for a whole cluster of attitudes and activities. They were able to discharge this function precisely because they incorporated moral and metaphysical theories and claims. Moreover, these theories and claims had a certain degree of complexity, and there existed within the community of public school headmasters and within the community of professors public debate as to the significance of their role and function. Thomas Arnold's Rugby was not Edward Thrigg's Uppingham. Mommsen's and Schollmoller represented very different academic stances from that of Max Weber, but the articulation of disagreement was always within the context of that deep moral agreement which constituted the character that each individual embodied in his own way. In our own time, Emotivism is a theory embodied in characters who all share the emotivist view of the distinction between rational and non-rational discourse, but who represent the embodiment of that distinction in very different social contexts. Two of these we have already noticed, the rich aesthete and the manager. To these we must now add a third, the therapist. The manager represents in his character the obliteration of the distinction between manipulative and non-manipulative social relations. The therapist represents the same obliteration in the sphere of personal life. The manager treats ends as given as outside his scope. His concern is with technique, with effectiveness in transforming raw materials into final products, unskilled labor into skilled labor, investment into profits. The therapist also treats ends as given, as outside his scope. His concern also is with technique, with effectiveness in transforming neurotic symptoms into directed energy, maladjusted individuals into well-adjusted ones. Neither manager nor therapist in their roles as manager and therapist do or are able to engage in moral debate. They are seen by themselves and by those who see them with the same eyes as their own as uncontested figures, who purport to restrict themselves to the realms in which rational agreement is possible. That is, of course, from their point of view, to the realm of fact, the realm of means, the realm of measurable effectiveness. It is, of course, important that in our culture the concept of the therapeutic has been given application far beyond the sphere of psychological medicine in which it obviously has its legitimate place. In The Triumph of the Therapeutic, 1966, and also in To My Fellow Teachers, 1975, Philip Reif has documented with devastating insight a number of the ways in which truth has been displaced as a value and replaced by psychological effectiveness. The idioms of therapy have invaded all too successfully such spheres as those of education and religion. The types of theory involved in and invoked to justify such therapeutic modes do, of course, vary wildly, but the mode itself is of far greater social significance than the theories which matter so much to its protagonists. I have said of characters in general that they are those social roles which provide a culture with its moral definitions. It is crucial to stress that I do not mean by this that the moral beliefs expressed by and embodied in the characters of a particular culture will secure universal assent within that culture. On the contrary, it is partially because they provide the focal points for disagreement that they are able to perform their defining task. Hence, the morally defining character of the managerial role in our own culture is evinced almost as much by the variety of contemporary attacks upon managerial and manipulative modes of theory and practice as it is by allegiance to to them. Those who persistently attack bureaucracy effectively reinforce the notion that it is in terms of a relationship to bureaucracy that the self has to define itself. Neo-Weberian organization theorists and the heirs of the Frankfurt School unwittingly collaborate as a chorus in the theater of the present. I do not want to suggest, of course, that there is anything peculiar to the present in this type of phenomenon. It is often, and perhaps always, through conflict that the self receives its social definition. This does not mean, however, as some theorists have supposed, that the self is or becomes nothing but the social roles which it inherits. The self, as distinct from its roles, has a history and a social history, and that of the contemporary emotivist self is only intelligible as the end product of a long and complex set of developments. Of the self, as presented by Emotivism, we must immediately note the following: that it cannot be simply or unconditionally identified with any particular moral attitude or point of view, including that of those characters which socially embody emotivism, just because of the fact that its judgments are in the end criterionless. The specifically modern self, the self that I have just called emotivist, finds no limits set to that on which it may pass judgment, for such limits could only derive from rational criteria for evaluation, and, as we have seen, the emotivist self lacks any such criteria. Everything may be criticized from whatever standpoint the self has adopted, including the self's choice of standpoint to adopt. It is in this capacity of the self to evade any necessary identification with any particular contingent state of affairs that some modern philosophers, both analytical and existentialist, have seen the essence of moral agency. To be a moral agent is, on this view, precisely to be able to stand back from any and every situation on which one is involved, from any and every characteristic that one possesses, and to pass judgment on it from a purely universal and abstract point of view that is totally detached from all social peculiarity. Anyone and everyone can thus be a moral agent, since it is in the self and not in social roles or practices that moral agency has to be located. The contrast between this democratization of moral agency and the elitist monopolies of managerial and therapeutic exercise could not be sharper. Any minimally rational agent is to be accounted as a moral agent, but managers and therapists enjoy their status in virtue of their membership within hierarchies of imputed skill and knowledge. In the domain of fact, there are procedures for eliminating disagreement. In that of morals, the ultimacy of disagreement is dignified by the title pluralism. This democratized self, which has no necessary social content and no necessary social identity, can then be anything, can assume any role or take any point of view, because it is in and for itself nothing. This relationship of the modern self to its acts and its roles has been conceptualized by its acutest and most perceptive theorists in what at first sight appear to be two quite different and incompatible ways. Sartre, I speak now only of the Sartre of the 30s and 40s, has depicted the self as entirely distinct from any particular social role which it may happen to assume. Erving Goffman, by contrast, has liquidated the self into its role-playing, arguing that the self is no more than a so-called peg on which the clothes of the role are hung. Goffman, 1959, page 253. For Sartre, the central error is to identify the self with its roles, a mistake which carries the burden of moral bad faith as well as of intellectual confusion. For Goffman, the central error is to suppose that there is a substantial self over and beyond the complex presentations of role-playing, a mistake committed by those who wish to keep part of the human world so-called safe from sociology. Yet the two apparently contrasting views have much more in common than a first statement would lead one to suspect. In Goffman's anecdotal descriptions of the social world, there is still discernible that ghostly I, the psychological peg to whom Goffman denies substantial selfhood, flitting effervescently from one solidly role-structured situation to another. And for Sartre, the self's self-discovery is characterized as the discovery that the self is so-called nothing, is not a substance, but a set of perpetually open possibilities. Thus, at a deep level, a certain agreement underlies Sartre and Goffman's surface disagreements, and they agree in nothing more than in this, that both see the self as entirely set over against the social world. For Goffman, for whom the social world is everything, the self is therefore nothing at all. It occupies no social space. For Sartre, whatever social space it occupies, it does so only accidentally, and therefore he too sees the self as in no way an actuality. What moral modes are open to the self thus conceived? To answer this question, we must first recall the second key characteristic of the emotivist self, its lack of any ultimate criteria. When I characterize it thus, I am referring back to what we have already noticed, that whatever criteria or principles or evaluative allegiances the emotivist self may profess, they are to be construed as expressions of attitudes, preferences, and choices which are themselves not governed by criterion, principle, or value, since they underlie and are prior to all allegiance to criterion, principle, or value. But from this, it follows that the emotivist self can have no rational history in its transitions from one state of moral commitment to another. Inner conflicts are for it necessarily au fond, the confrontation of one contingent arbitrariness by another. It is a self with no given continuities, save those of the body, which is its bearer, and of the memory which, to the best of its ability, gathers in its past. And we know from the outcome of the discussions of personal identity by Locke, Berkeley, Butler, and Hume, that neither of these separately or together are adequate to specify that identity and continuity of which actual selves are so certain. The self thus conceived, utterly distinct on the one hand from its social embodiments, and lacking on the other any rational history of its own, may seem to have a certain abstract and ghostly character. It is therefore worth remarking that a behaviorist account is as much or as little plausible of the self conceived in this manner as of the self conceived in any other. The appearance of an abstract and ghostly quality arises not from any lingering Cartesian dualism, but from the degree of contrast, indeed the degree of loss, that comes into view if we compare the emotivist self with its historical predecessors. For one way of re-envisaging the emotivist self is as having suffered a deprivation, a stripping away of the qualities that were once believed to belong to the self. The self is now thought of as lacking any necessary social identity, because the kind of social identity that it once enjoyed is no longer available. The self is now thought of as criterionless, because the kind of telos, in terms of which it once judged and acted, is no longer thought to be credible. What kind of identity and what kind of telos were they? In many pre-modern traditional societies, it is thought his or her membership in a variety of social groups that the individual identifies him or herself that the individual identifies him or herself and is identified by others. I am brother, cousin, and grandson, member of this household, that village, this tribe. These are not characteristics that belong to human beings accidentally, to be stripped away in order to discover the so-called real me. They are part of my substance, defining partially, at least, and sometimes wholly, my obligations and my duties. Individuals' inherent a particular space within an interlocking set of social relationships. Lacking that space, they are nobody, or, at best, a stranger or an outcast. To know oneself as such a social person is, however, not to occupy a static and fixed position. It is to find oneself placed at a certain point on a journey with a set of goals. To move through life is to make progress, or to fail to make progress, toward a given end. Thus, a completed and fulfilled life is an achievement, and death is the point at which someone can be judged happy or unhappy. Hence the ancient Greek proverb, "Call no man happy until he is dead." This conception of a whole human life as the primary subject of objective and impersonal evaluation, of a type of evaluation which provides the content for judgment upon the particular action or projects of a given individual, is something that ceases to be generally available at some point in the progress, if we can call it such, towards and into modernity. It passes to some degree unnoticed, for it is celebrated historically for the most part not as a loss, but as a self-congratulatory gain, as the emergence of the individual freed on the one hand from the social bonds of those constraining hierarchies which the modern world rejected at its birth, and on the other hand from what modernity has taken to be the superstitions of teleology. To say this is, of course, to move a little too quickly beyond my present argument, but it is to note that the peculiarly modern self, the emotivist self, in acquiring sovereignty in his own realm, lost its traditional boundaries provided by a social identity and a view of human life as ordered to a given end. Nevertheless, as I have already suggested, the emotivist self has its own kind of social definition. It is home in, it is an integral part of, one distinctive type of social order, that which we, in the so-called advanced countries, presently inhabit. Its definition is the counterpart to the definition of those characters which inhabit and present the dominant social roles. The bifurcation of the contemporary social world into a realm of the organizational in which ends are taken to be given and are not available for rational scrutiny, and a realm of the personal in which judgments and debate about values are central factors, but in which no rational social resolution of issues is available, finds its internalization, its inner representation in the relation of the individual self to the roles and characters of social life. This bifurcation is itself an important clue to the central characteristics of modern societies, and one which may enable us to avoid being deceived by their own internal political debates. Those debates are often staged in terms of a supposed opposition between individualism and collectivism, each appearing in a variety of doctrinal forms. On the one side, there appears the self-defined protagonist of the individual liberty, on the other side, self-defined protagonists of planning and regulation, of goods which are available through bureaucratic organization. But in fact, what is crucial is that on which the contending parties agree, namely that there are only two alternative modes of social life open to us, one in which the free and arbitrary choices of individuals are sovereign, and one in which the bureaucracy is sovereign, precisely so that it may limit the free and arbitrary choices of individuals. Given this deep cultural agreement, it is unsurprising that the politics of modern societies oscillate between a freedom which is nothing but a lack of regulation of individual behavior and forms of collectivist control designed only to limit the anarchy of self-interest. The consequences of a victory by one side or the other are often of the highest immediate importance, but as Solzhenitsyn has understood so well, both ways of life are in the long run intolerable. Thus, the society in which we live is one in which bureaucracy and individualism are partners as well as antagonists, and it is in the cultural climate of this bureaucratic individualism that the emotivist self is naturally at home. The parallel between my treatment of what I have called the emotivist self and my treatment of the emotivist theories of moral judgment, whether Stevensonian, Nietzschean, or Sartrean, is now, I hope, clear. In both cases, I have argued that we are confronted with what is intelligible only as the end product of a process of historical change. In both cases, I have confronted theoretical positions whose protagonists claim that what I take to be historically produced characters of what is specifically modern are, in fact, the timelessly necessary characteristics of all and any moral judgments, of all and any selfhood. If my argument is correct, we are not, although many of us have become or partly become what Sartre and Goffman say we are, precisely because we are the last inheritors, so far, of a process of historical transformation. This transformation of the self and its relationship to its roles from more traditional modes of existence into contemporary emotivist forms could not have occurred, of course, if the forms of moral discourse, the language of morality, had not also been transformed at the same time. Indeed, it is wrong to separate the history of the self and its roles from the history of the language which the self specifies and through which the roles are given expression. What we discover is a single history and not two parallel ones. I have noted at the outset two central factors of contemporary moral utterance. One was the multifariousness and apparent incommensurability of the concepts invoked. The other was the assertive use of ultimate principles in attempts to close moral debate. To discover where these features of our discourse came from, how and why they are fashioned, is therefore an obvious strategy for my inquiry. To this task I now turn.